You really started getting into the game in the late 50s, right? Collegiate
Mid
stuff.
to late 50s. Well, just when I went to college, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I guess Lester Blakely and I won the national collegiate doubles in 59 and 60. My last 2 years at SMU, so yeah.
Well, back in those days, did the collegiates, did Bob Kilner come down to the collegiates? What are your memories of Bob Kilner from those days, or were you not even that aware of the Handball Association?
I really wasn't aware that much of the association. Kindler didn't show up to collegiates I went to, but Mort Levy, the executive director, editor, did everything for the Handball Association. He always showed up at the collegiates. And quite often the collegiates would be at interesting places that had terrible courts, and it was primarily because Mort wanted to go to Miami and have the national collegiates, which were 2 outdoor 4-wall courts with concrete floors with the sun beating on your head. I was kind of hoping he had wanted to go to Hawaii sometime, but he never did. So.
Well, from your memory, speak of some of the innovations that you heard that Kindler is kind of taking credit for, that people like to associate with him, and how you think they help the game.
Well, I think the glass court mainly. There at the Aurora, I think the Aurora YMCA there, they had the first glass court that was completely glass, except for the front wall. And but apparently they didn't play a whole lot there. It was actually too difficult to see the ball because the glass did come all the way to the floor, and it was kind of dark there. I put on a handball clinic at that club about 3 or 4 years ago, and still a neat-looking court, but you really, although it was glass all the way around, there really wasn't a lot of space back behind the glass where you could get a lot of spectators, but it was dark. But the glass and the ball, it evolved a whole bunch of different ways, and then coming along with the so-called family ball for women to start playing. I think there was actually a cover on the magazine that just showed a ball with somebody holding it with fingernail polish, and I believe that was his wife, Evie, holding the ball, but all you saw was the ball back then. And these were the 2 main things. Of course, the association did, as Ken Snyder mentioned, really started pushing the juniors and the collegiates. And that's what really, I think that's the reason we're alive and kicking today, is because they really started doing a good job with these programs. Not as good as they do now, but at least they started it.
Well, what about what I've always heard about the Olympics and is associated with? You know anything about that? Can you speak about his desire to get into the Olympics and how that affected? As I've heard stuff he talked about a few times, it seems like, about how it affected his reluctance to start pro handball.
That's what I had heard, that he was apparently very close friends with Avery Brundage, who was the head of the Olympic IOC or whatever they call it. And apparently Avery was an old handball player too, but Bob wanted it to be in the Olympics, so he refused to make it a pro sport. And at one time, I think he said that it only took like 12 countries to say, okay, we can do it. And Bob thought we had about 7 or 8 countries. He thought it was reasonable, even into the early 70s, 73, something like there, 74. And somewhere about that time, and apparently they changed how many countries it took to say okay before they'd put it in. It took something like 28 or 30, which and Kindler realized that was totally impossible. So they decided to start the Pro Tour. They actually tried to start it. They didn't try to start it, but they were going to have a Pro Tour start a year before then. Ray Kroc, the McDonald's guy, was going to put up money for a Pro Tour for 1 year. And they sent out 16 contracts. I got a contract. And they were going to play like 10 tournaments and guarantee $10,000 a tournament. And this was before Kindler. This was when Kindler still wanted it to be an amateur sport. And Kindler kind of let the word out, you guys do this, you can't play in USHA events anymore. And for that reason, most people didn't send back the contract. I think there's only 2 or 3 people who sent back the contract. And part of it also was that Habber was kind of the go-between, and some people were a little bit reluctant to commit to something like this. And most of us felt that, hey, this would be great. He guaranteed us money and expenses. But most of us felt like this guy's going to lose every penny, and after a year he's going to say, you know, sorry, it was a nice try, and then where would we play? So I think that was the main reason that people didn't send their contracts back in.
Did you know about the, let's try to make sure he's a little more, let's give him lead space. Do you want back a bit? Front way. There you go.
You can cut out the part about Habber.
No, hey, you know what? He talked about that. It wasn't Kroc, though, it was Tannenbaum,
Was
guy
it?
from Canada.
Was it?
Yeah. And he talks, in fact, you just verified his story because I didn't believe it.
Yeah. But was that who it was? I was thinking it was a McDonald's.
It was, but he had what he had done was
So you want to give it a little bit of
yeah. See, we're giving him lead space over here.
Gotcha.
Okay. This guy had sold a Canadian franchise and made millions off that. So it was like Stanley Tannenbaum or something like that. And,
Okay.
I remember Ray, but it wasn't Ray Kroc. And but he told this actual story about Kindler not wanting to start. That's part where he said Bob was an egotistical man. He was actually leading into that about the innovations, and so that's why he started the pro tour. He couldn't stand being left out, that sort of thing. And we'll soften it up a little bit. Well, what about getting back to Kindler? Again, this goes back to your earliest days of playing ball. He joked about how he'd go to tournaments and see guys literally playing in their underwear. I mean, and I've seen the old films of guys with tournaments without their shirts on. Remember going to tournaments down in Corpus, seeing guys play without their shirts, and they're soaked through, and you could see, I could see them basically. They were just, those tiny little, thin fabric shorts and everything. There was a certain kind of unprofessional look to the game as it was played, perhaps. Do you think Kindler had anything to do with helping out on the uniforms and that sort of thing?
Well, actually, yeah, now that you mention it, because at one time, if you read the old rules, you had to wear all white. And so everybody said you have to wear all white because it's easier to see the ball. They didn't want colors in there where somebody might not see a ball come by a pair of dark blue shorts or something like this. But then they really thought that television was going to be possible. Kindler really thought it was, and so they put some color in. I cannot remember the years, I'm thinking early 70s, that they came out with the so-called pastel colors, the light blue and the golds, and some colors like this. And it was also one of the reasons I think they changed the color of the ball to blue, that they thought it would pick up on television better than black. And it was also partly because there was a lot of clubs being built that weren't necessarily geared to handball players, and so there was a lot of racquetball, and the black ball was just marking the courts up like crazy. So the club owner said, can no longer have a black racquetball, and they included handball too, even though the handball really didn't mark it up. So it was another reason I think they went to blue. And of course they experimented with different colored balls. Steve August won a ball one time that was played, I think, in Arizona, a red one. They sent me an orange ball one time to try out, and the glass, because we had the glass court at the university, and it was great up in the glass. You couldn't see it on the floor. You drop it to serve it, and it was hard to see because it was too close to the color of the floor. So, but they really thought they had something there. They thought, boy, this is really going to be great. But that didn't work at all.
That's been my experience. I don't know why that was a deal that they thought it would help. It seems like they're both almost equally easy to see when I watch them on video, black and blue. But I guess it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of wish that we would do what Ireland does, is paint the front walls a real light. Have you seen their courts over there? They film, even
Haven't
the
noticed.
main ones. The front walls aren't white.
Kind of a gray? Or
Yeah, it's
eggshell?
usually a real light green or a light blue or something like that, and it picks up really well. It's really a lot easier to see the corners and everything.
That makes sense.
And
Does make
at
sense.
one time, Kendler wanted to paint stripes up the corners of all the courts. Thought that would give the court, instead of just this white blank thing, you could actually see dimensions and in detail better. And I'm not sure why they didn't do that. I thought that might have been a good idea.
Yeah, I like the color better because it makes sense. The contrast and everything, you would be able to see the crotch in the walls and everything.
Yeah.
Because definitely when white gets too hot and bright, it saturates and it's just
Yeah,
a big
that's hard,
solid mass.
right? Especially when it's freshly painted.
Mhm.
Remember the new courts, when they first built the courts at Texas, and you went in there and you couldn't tell where the corners were. Things were so white. Then there was the court we went to in Indianapolis, and they had painted the floor white. It was the way they did a lot of squash courts. It was mainly a squash club. Well, they painted the floor white in the handball, and you couldn't tell where the floor met the walls. So you'd try to take a shot out of the rear corner, and all you would see is white, and you didn't know where you were. So it was
Where
a
do
little
you,
bit interesting.
how'd you have them play in that?
Actually,
Clinic?
no, I think the university was looking for some flooring materials for the new courts they built in Belmont. They had put floors in there that weren't very good, and so they sent us around. They sent us to Mexico, they sent us to Toronto, and they sent us to Indianapolis to try to find top quality flooring to replace in those Belmont courts.
Let's see.
And those were terrible in Indianapolis.
Yeah, I don't know. It's funny though. It's funny that they thought it was a good idea. But you said squash did. I didn't realize squash used white floors.
A lot of them do. Now they kind of bleach the floors.
Hmm.
You know, it's a real bleached wood, and even some handball courts they do that now. And it's not
Okay,
too bad.
let's talk about Jacobs. About some of the, because I know you talked to me a lot about. I want to try to get on tape because you have a pretty high opinion of him, and you even use the word genius at times and that sort of thing about his some of his, not so much for handball, but for his business acumen and stuff like that. I'm gonna give you an open mic here, and ask your son to. That was good, to keep you in frame. But tell me about Jacobs and your impressions of him over the years.
Well, a little history. First meeting him when he came to a Dallas tournament, and I was playing in the tournament. I was at SMU in Dallas and at the Dallas Athletic Club, and just had a chance to get in the court with him and ask him to help me out. And I don't know why I had the courage to do that. That's how dumb I probably was, but he immediately took a great liking to me. I have no idea why. And in fact, he walked in one day and Marty was behind him. And Jimmy comes up to me and I've got some shirt on, I have no idea, and Jimmy's touching my shirt saying, "God, this is a great shirt. This is really a wonderful shirt." Said, "Would you like to trade shirts?" And he's kind of got his hands on my shoulder and everything like this, and then he walks away, and Marty comes up to me, and I'm kind of sitting there thinking, this is a nice guy, but this is just strange. And Marty comes up to me and says, "Jimmy likes you." He says, don't get him wrong. He says he's very affectionate when he likes you, and Jimmy really likes you. I said, "Why?" He says, "I don't know, but he really likes you." So over the years, I felt like he was one of my closest friends, even though I rarely saw him, except at tournaments. But we talked on the phone occasionally. He called me up quite a bit. And when my old handball partner, Dick Robertson, who was also a good friend of Jimmy's, went up to New York, he stayed with Jimmy, and Jimmy called me up one time and says, "Pete Tyson says, what is a bush millet?" I said, "What?" He said, "What is a bush millet?" I said, "Robertson keeps calling me a bush millet." I said, "You mean a bush mullet?" He said, "Yeah, that's what he is. What is that?" I said, "I don't know, Jimmy. You'll have to ask him on that." But he was a great friend over the years. Anytime that when I started teaching, I thought I knew something about handball, but I really didn't. So anytime I had a question about anything, whether it was how to develop the offhand or anything else, I would call him or write him, and he would write me back volumes, or he'd call me up, or next time we saw each other, we'd go out to dinner, and he would help. And he came down to Texas when we opened up the new courts. He even came down there when I first started teaching, when we were in those old little bitty courts over there, and put on a clinic afterwards. And I really do think this guy was the most intelligent player we ever had. And he probably could have won without being that smart. The guy was blazing speed and great strength, huge hooks. But he was also, I believe, the first guy to really make the game into a science. He really had a purpose for every shot that he hit. And he could explain it. And most great athletes that I've seen in most sports over the years weren't necessarily good teachers. They did it because they could do it. And it was like, do what I do. But Jimmy could explain it. He was a great teacher. And when I wrote my first handball book, 1970, Jimmy called me up after he saw the book and said, "Oh, this is a marvelous book. I'm going to buy 1,000 copies to give to my friends." I said, but as I was writing it, I would talk to Jimmy. I said, "Jimmy, why don't we kind of do this together? Because all I'm doing is taking what you have been telling me all these years and writing it down." He said, no, I don't have time to do that. And I can't do it as well as you can. He would flatter you like crazy. And you would liked it. When you talked to Jimmy and he left, you felt good. The guy was just a marvelous person. He had this beautiful speaking voice. And he gave everybody else credit for things. We still give a Jim Jacobs award. Stuffy called me up. I guess the day he died was about 3 days before one of our major tournaments. And I couldn't believe it. Nobody could believe it. And we started the Jacobs, we call Sportsmanship Award, that we do every year at Texas. On a court, he looked so effortless. He would be against the left side wall. Somebody would power it down the right side wall. And you knew that it would take a great amount of effort just to get over there. And he would just be there. And you're sitting there watching and say, God, it didn't even look like he was trying very hard. He just kind of appeared over there. So the question over the years is always, all right, who's the greatest player that's ever played the game? Of course, it's Jacobs or Alvarado. And you can't deny Nadi's record. And if you just go by the record, you'd have to say Nadi. But I think the greatest player I ever saw was Jacobs. He pretty much dominated for about 10 years. Not sure else where to go with this right this second.
I want to hear a little bit about, because I know, Nadi was originally kind of a Southwest player, played out of El Paso, right, in Juarez, Bob Lindsey and all that. Can you give me your first recollections of seeing this guy play and what your impressions of him were?
Well, I'll tell you the first time I ever met him, I put on a handball clinic in El Paso quite a few years ago. And it was in the evening, and after I did the clinic, they said, would you put on another clinic? And I said, sure, when? They said, well, tonight. I said, I thought we were just done. I said, no, we're going to go out to dinner, and I want you to put on a clinic because we got this little kid over in the Mexico side that we're going to bring to dinner, and he doesn't speak English. And so you tell him things that he should do, and we'll translate. And there's a little skinny kid, and that was Nadi Alvarado. So that was kind of interesting. But all I saw at first was just a great athlete, who was a pure offensive machine, who, when he was on, was amazing, and when he was off, could lose in a hurry. And when he was competing, I remember him playing Paul Habber at our nationals before he got that good. And they had a little to do in the court, the ball rolling around, and they wouldn't roll it back to each other. And Nadi, he was young, he was still maturing, so he wasn't that good yet. But and I guess Bob Lindsey went out there. Of course, Bob was a student of mine at UT, but then he went to El Paso and started playing with him a lot. Bob was a great ball player, and I think that's when he started coming up. And I know that, and I believe, I can't remember which nationals it was in Austin, if it was 65 or 69, that Bob Kindler said, we're going to give the first scholarship ever, college scholarship, to Nadi Alvarado to come to the University of Texas. And I thought, well, that's good. Of course, never happened. As far as I know, Nadi still never went to college, so we may still try to recruit him. But he was an amazing physical player. He was very offensive because he was so quick, and of course Mort Levy named him El Gato because of his quickness, that he was able to get into offensive positions. And everybody said, you need to teach more offense. I said, well, if you can move like Nadi, yeah, we can teach more offense, but because he could get there. But he was still, even when he was winning some nationals, or at the beginning, he was still very beatable because he served and he tried to kill it. And so he would win some, he would lose some. Freddie kicked his butt pretty good in Chicago that one time, and then he became a smarter player. He actually started going over there and punching the ball to the ceiling with his offhand, and got where he could do it spectacular. And he started playing what I call a Jim Jacobs intelligent handball game, learning when to go on the defense. Even though he still liked to play offense, like a lot of great players, he decided he was going to win. And when he started doing that, he didn't lose for a long time. You know, the great thing about doing that is it allows you to win on off days. It's easy to win when your offense is clicking, but what do you do when it's not? Well, that's what he learned. And I have no idea how many tournaments in a row he won, but 11 national championships, that's absurd in this game.
Well, here's my memory of that 73 match, and let me ask you about this. From what I was hearing from you guys, that Nadi was really ahead of the game because he was only 17 when he played Paul, 73. And did you, at that point, not think that at some point he was going to come up and be a champ, or did you have your doubts about someone who was 17 and that far progressed, or was he not as far progressed as, say, Collins and some of these other young guys when they're younger? Did he not impress you as being, was he just another good young player, or did you think he was something special?
At that point, I just thought he was a very good young player, and I really didn't foresee, what he was really going to do. Like a lot of young guys like that, you don't know what their intentions are or how much drive they have. Or do they really want to do that? Do they really want to do what it takes to be that great? And so at that age, it was kind of hard to tell. I thought the same thing about Vern Roberts. Great young player, but it looked like, it was okay if he did and okay if he didn't. And I remember talking to him when he was in college. I said, if you really want it, you can be one of the great players. And he kind of shrugged me off. And a couple of years later, out at I think Odessa tournament, he came up to me and said, I really want to do this now. And he did. He became a marvelous player.
I guess you could say anything about Chapman. Starting off so young, how much longer he's going to keep playing, or, what's going to happen with him.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
We'll cover him in a second. Let's talk about the, as long as I can remember, and perhaps because of your association with Leanne over the years, you've always been tied to women's handball. Can you give us some kind of historical perspective on, on the USHA and women's handball, or just women's handball in the game, because obviously it was non-existent at one point, and kind of just give me a quick rundown of how you feel like women's participation in the game is going to benefit the game.
Well, as far as how it started, I'm not even sure. There were a very few women that played. I know there were women that played up in New York, played one wall, And of course, Bob Davison's wife was probably the most famous woman handball player, Pauline, who actually played four-wall, and they wouldn't let her play in tournaments for a long time because it was a men's event, and it was probably pretty good for a lot of men that they didn't let her play because she could beat a lot of these guys. And Bob Davison used to say he had the greatest collection of handball gloves of anybody. He said he would just stand outside the court after Pauline played a guy, and the guy would go out and throw his gloves away, and so Bob would collect the gloves, you know. And but I had a few women try at the university. You know, I've been teaching. I was hired to teach handball in 1960, and this is my 41st year now of doing this. And there were a few women that tried it and really wanted to do it, but the ball was just a killer. Most women just didn't have much natural padding in the hand, and the ball was too tough. And yet we still kept trying to do it. And so when we first started doing it at the university, we played with a racquetball. Of course, now they call it the Big Blue, but that's kind of what we did back then. And there was a couple of racquetballs that you could actually put a needle in and pump up and make pretty fast. And that was the ball they played with. And the first women's tournament we had at the university was played with that kind of a ball. And there was probably 20, 25 women from the University of Texas and A&M that played. And Bob Kilner was really into it. You know, he really liked the idea of doing something good to the sport, bringing the women in there. You know, he thought that would make it more attractive, which obviously has. And so they were trying different balls out, and they came up with what was called the family ball, made by the Merco company out of Australia, maybe. And it was a good ball to start with. It was slower, it was softer, and it played pretty well. And the women liked it, and the game started progressing. And then, which surprised a lot of the guys, some of these women got a lot better than anybody thought. And the women started hitting the ball harder with more power than a whole lot of the guys did. And they wanted a faster ball. And a few of the women would play with the men's ball, and a few still do. But by and large, most of them wouldn't, because it was just too painful, and they certainly wouldn't start with that ball. And so they went to what became the white ace, which I believe was actually a paddle ball that was very fast, and as fast as, maybe faster than the men's ball, although lighter weight, you know, like 44 grams as opposed to about 60. And the game really took off in that respect. It still hasn't caught on with the women all around the country. There's a lot of women who graduate from colleges and they go to a club and they call me up and say, you know, there's no other women who play here. And I say, yeah, I know that is kind of a problem. There's certain hotbeds of handball where women play, but they're kind of scattered, so most of the women play with the guys. And also, some of the better women do play with the men's ball now, mainly, not that they like it better, I don't think. They may say they do, but I don't think so. I think it's because they can get competition. They get a lot of guys that play, and as you've seen the last couple of years, that we got women that are playing in men's open events and winning matches. So they have really come a long way.
Well, what about from a standpoint of just the growth of the association and just inclusiveness? I mean, how would you characterize how women have helped handball, if at all?
Not really sure on this. It's still a very small group as far as the handball players. I think it's a great addition. I think it's, like I said, an attractive addition, and their competition is great, but their numbers still aren't. No matter how hard you try, the numbers still aren't there. It's just, and I think it's mainly because they don't get the opportunity to play when they're younger, just like happened with the guys. There weren't courts that kids could go to except up in New York, and this is one of the reasons a lot of great players came out of New York. I think it's also the reason a lot of the great players were Jewish, because Jewish community centers had those kids playing handball when they were younger. So they got more opportunity. Today, I don't, the colleges are doing a great job. There's 40 to 50 women showing up at the National Collegiate Tournament, and there didn't used to be that many men show up at National Collegiate Tournaments. So the college teams around the country are doing a good job of promoting it, but that's about the only place it's coming from, except for a few pockets, like in Chicago and up in Nebraska, where they do just a great job with their youth program. Wherever they have good youth programs, they seem to bring in some girls that play, even in Southern California, out of that area. But there's not many of them, and there's not enough of them. And like I said, it's still a pretty small population of the Handball Association.
Handball, and you've been involved in trying to teach other teachers how to teach handball along with Leanne over the years. How important to the development and growth of the game is it to get handball into the public schools at an early age, that sort of thing?
Oh, I think handball will disappear if it's not done. There are those few pockets, as I was mentioning, around the country where they have some good youth programs, but that's not enough to really sustain. All you do is look at our national championships and you say, man, you got 600 players. I said, yeah, but 2/3 of them are over 40 now, and it used to be just the opposite. And so, and this is what's happening all around the country. You go into places and they say, we don't have any young players. I say, well, what are you doing about it? It's like, well, we never had to do anything before about it. Well, that was when it was being taught in every college in the country. And that was before racquetball came along. So a guy would go to a YMCA after he got out of college, maybe to play basketball or something, and would discover handball. And now racquetball's kind of taken that part of it over. So it's extremely important, I think, that every kid coming out of public schools knows what handball is. And so that was the idea behind all the clinics and going to the national PE conventions. We've been going to the National Physical Education Convention for 15 years. And Leanne and I wrote teaching guides on how to teach handball in elementary schools and in secondary schools, as well as the four-wall teaching guide. And we hand out anywhere from 900 to 1,300 teaching guides every year to these teachers that come in from all over the country. Thousands of teachers come to this convention. And of course, Leanne's made films on it, and we put on clinics whenever we can in public schools. It's hard because of the walls, because there's a lot of schools that don't have any wall space. It's what can you do? And there's not much you can do. But it would be great, like when I was in Tucson, going around these schools and seeing these outdoor three-wall courts all over the place. If there was things like that all over the country, the courts that they have in Arizona around the public schools, this game would really take off. And maybe, because we're really trying to get them to put handball into the curriculum, maybe the interest will get there, so that when, especially, kills me when a school builds a new gymnasium and the outside walls is fancy brickwork and all kinds of things, and they could have spent half the money and made it a smooth concrete surface and had great courts. And so maybe it'll get to that point where we can get to these people that are building these gyms and make sure we have some flat wall space for these kids to play. And that's the hardest thing. Probably the hardest thing about developing youth programs is, okay, now you teach them to play, now what happens? Where can they go? Are there any public courts? Does Austin have any outdoor public courts for kids to go play? Absolutely not. And so it's tough. Some of the clubs are too expensive for the kids to play, or universities just don't allow, and they don't have room for the kids to come in and play. So it's a struggle. And unless we can convince the public schools to put it into the curriculum, we offer all kinds of stuff. We offer free equipment for all the kids. And even back at the college level, it used to be taught in every college. And now at the PE conventions, some old guy will come up to me from some college, "Oh yeah, we used to teach this." And I said, "Well, you're like everybody else." I said, "Well, yeah, we should do that again." And I said, "Well, the Handball Association will give you free gloves, free handballs, free eye guards, free teaching guides if you'll put in a class and get it started again." And some of the colleges have done that, which is great. So there isn't just one approach. It's like pieces of a whole pie. You got to try to promote it in different ways, and this is just one way. It's not the cure. These booklets and the conventions and trying to get some clinics into the schools. There's a whole combination of things. But it's great when you have somebody in a particular town who's willing to do what they do in some of these places around the country, where all the good young players are coming out of these places. But like I said, there's not too many of them right now.
So you're speaking, when you talk about the free gloves, that's all part of what the development fund is meant to do.
Yeah, the development fund is spectacular. The handball players are amazing. The handball players are donating close to $100,000 a year, every year, just saying, "Here, use this and promote our game." Now, most of the money is coming from the older guys, partially because they can afford it, partially because they played the game for 50, 60 years, they love the game, and they've kind of seen that, hey, this game's getting older, we need more young people in there. So this money that is donated to the Handball Association, to the development fund, is for the development of the game. And that's where the money comes to send us to clinics and to pay for the printing of the guides and to offer this free equipment. If you want to start a juniors program, get 12 juniors together, call the U.S. Handball Association, they'll send you free gloves, balls, eye guards, get them started. So that's been one of the biggest pieces of the pie, that development fund, that has allowed us to do these kinds of things to try to get the kids playing.
What's your take on televising handball to help it out? Particularly with the Pro Tour.
I love watching it, and nobody's watched any more handball than I have for the last 40, 50 years. And when it's on TV, even filmed great, it's not easy to see. And we're talking about people who really know what's going on. Now, there have been some special matches filmed, like Bike and Chapman, that was marvelous. And especially the slow motion stuff. This was great. You could really see what was going on. But the average person, unless they figure out some other way to televise it, or they obviously can't do it live, even though Ireland does it, but kids in Ireland grow up, they know what handball is. So when they see it on TV, they actually kind of know what's going on, just like we do in other sports. We see other sports we grew up playing, it's easier to watch. But most kids don't grow up playing handball, and the ball is so small, moves around so fast, that is very, very difficult to televise. I don't know if this would promote the game more or not. I really don't.